Okay, so I'm delighted to have Philip Kitcher, the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University, and Max Kahn Hayward, Lecturer of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield, join me today for the first of our PPE in a time of pandemic panels. And today we're going to be talking about moral dilemmas, moral risk, and science in a democratic society. And so without further ado, I'd like to start asking our panelists some questions. So my first question is for Philip. Philip, in the ethical project, you address ethics as a kind of social technology. Can you explain what this means and what it means for attempts to create ethical norms to govern novel and serious situations like the one that we find ourselves in? And such as, for example, the emergence of norms concerning social distancing.
Well, let me begin with the general view. I approach ethical questions in a somewhat different way from many other philosophers. It seems to me useful to ask, we have this form of ethical life, we blame people, we give people rules, we prescribe patterns for their behavior and so on and so forth. Where did all that come from? And my hypothesis is that it's very old. I think that's easy to confirm because by the time we get to the first written documents that humans ever left behind for us, about 5,000 years ago, already you can see that there are all sorts of complex rules in play and complex ethical considerations that have been developed. So I think human ethical life goes back about 50,000 to 100,000 years, and that it plays a role in making us the kinds of creatures we are. That is, I think we're evolutionarily adapted to live in groups with other people, quite unusual groups that are mixed by age and sex. And in order to do that, we need an ability to respond to one another. That is, to adjust our behavior in light of the kinds of thoughts and feelings that we attribute to others. And that isn't absolutely perfect. We all know that. We all know that we're often very unresponsive to other people. And so ethics comes together as a kind of collective project that is introduced because of our need to make this go more smoothly. And that's what I mean by saying it's an ethical technology. And it's not as though I reject the view that we're out to sort of find some eternal ethical truth that's somehow waiting for us to discover it. It's more something that we make up as we go along and as new situations come in to challenge us. So when we've got a new situation like a pandemic, what we have to do is try to figure out ways of being responsive to one another. And that means being inclusive in our thinking about people who will be impacted by various things that we might do, and trying to work out ways of behaving that everybody can live with. So for example, I'm an old guy, and if it turns out that I need at some stage a respirator or a ventilator, and somebody 40 years younger than me, in the prime of life and health, is also in need of it, and there's only one available, and we can't double up on it because the settings that we would need for it are different, then I have to think about whether or not I should concede that to this other person. And my inclination is to say that that other person has priority over me. And I would expect the other person to see me as somebody who should think in that way. So the ethical task is always to try to think through the situation you're in such a way as to take into account all the people that are likely to be affected by your action, and to try to come to some rule or norm or pattern of behavior that would, as it were, be acceptable to all. And it would be acceptable to me. I wouldn't like it, but it would be acceptable to me to say the 40-year-old, the 30-year-old has priority if there's only one ventilator left. So that's the sort of thing I have in mind. We're constantly trying to make up new ways of amplifying, good technological word, our responsiveness to others. And we do it by taking into account the perspectives of all of those who are involved and trying to engage with them in a way that everybody feels is an appropriate outcome.
Great. So if I could ask you a follow-up question.
Absolutely.
So in the work that we're discussing, you also draw on Mill's concept of an experiment in living.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could just explain to us what experiments in living are and whether you see our response to the pandemic as an opportunity to perform such an experiment or experiments.
It's a very peculiar phrase. And what he has in mind is people trying things out to see how they work. And that's very much in line with the kind of technological approach that I'm imagining. I mean, experiments have to have rules. You can't hurt people in doing these experiments. But as long as you make every precaution, you do everything you can to prevent people who haven't consented to participate in the experiment from being hurt, then it's a matter of trying out various kinds of lifestyles. As in the 19th century, Mill and Harriet Taylor proposed women should be able to do if they wanted to have careers, if they wanted to run for parliament and so on and so forth. All the conservatives of the age were predicting absolute disaster. And Mill and Taylor's response was, give it a try, see what happens, as long as people go into it with their eyes open. Okay, now what about the pandemic? Is it an opportunity to engage in experiments of living? There's something that really grates on me in that formulation. I don't think the pandemic's an opportunity to do anything. I think the pandemic is something that we have to work our way through as best we can. But our successors, after it's all over and we've done our best to make the right decisions and to support people and to keep our countries and our societies and our local communities going, when that's all over, it may, of course, deliver data about what kinds of things work satisfactorily and what work unsatisfactorily in situations like the ones that we're going to encounter. So I don't like the idea of seeing as a deliberate experiment, but willy-nilly, we will be doing things that have not yet been tried, and therefore we will be giving experimental data to our successors, assuming, of course, we don't all get wiped out.
Right. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But this is an opportunity maybe to ask a question of Max. So Max, you share Philip's conception of ethics as a mutable human creation and as responsive to human needs. Can you think of any ways in which this crisis might offer us cause, I don't want to use the term opportunities again, but maybe a stimulus to improve our moral culture?
Yes, well, I mean, it is clear that we are, as we speak, inventing new norms. I mean, no one had the concept of social, well, I mean, maybe some people did, but I assume none of the audience had the concept of social distancing a month or 2 months ago. But social distancing isn't just a government policy. It requires a lot of normative expectations about how we relate to each other, the kinds of activities that we think it's acceptable for us to behave in, and what our responsibilities are to the people around us. And that is a radical revision of the way that we normally think about going our everyday lives. I was sort of amused to note that, yeah, I'm in England, and the English are famous for their kind of social awkwardness in the search of politeness. And there's the joke, when two English people are trying to go through a door, they're both saying, "Oh, after you," and that's a norm. It's a very, might seem trivial norm, but I've noticed on the streets around me, new norms of people trying to negotiate how to avoid getting close to each other and putting each other at risk. So we are in the process of thinking in new ways about how to keep each other safe. But what I think is really important about that process of collectively trying to come up with new ways to live together is that I think it's challenged two, I think, regrettable features of how many people in our society have often thought about their moral responsibilities. And so one is the assumption that loads of our consumption behavior is just not morally scrutinizable. I don't know if that's a word, but that morality is about murder people, you don't steal from people, but we're not necessarily worrying about our responsibilities for other people in our day-to-day life, what we consume, how we live our lifestyles. And when we are doing that, and some people are more aware, we realize, oh, well, we are complicit or participating in contributing to problems like climate change or global poverty. we too often have a very individualized way of thinking about that. So the question is sort of, what should I do? And then we realize that it's actually very hard for a single individual to make a difference if they're not coordinating with other individuals. And what I think is really interesting about the way that the communities and societies are reacting to this pandemic is that we can't ignore it. We can't just sort of avoid it in the way that people have done with climate change or global poverty. It's there. And we've thought about every part of our life, what are our responsibilities to other people, and how can we solve this as a collective moral problem? The moral question isn't about one individual in isolation. It's about we. What can we do to solve it? And my hope is that we will develop ways of thinking and habits of thinking and relying on one another that hopefully will succeed in allowing us to get through this and to protect one another, and that we can then take to solving problems like climate change, which require this collective responsibility and cooperation.
Thank you. Now, if I can return to Philip. So in a recent conversation, you mentioned to me that you've been thinking a lot recently about the ways in which we might be failing to apply an appropriately moral lens to the actions of our leaders. And in particular, you suggested that the people who are governing us might have distinctive moral responsibilities that they're neglecting. So I wondered if you wanted to say a little more about that.
So I think we've actually overdrawn a moral from Machiavelli. I mean, Machiavelli is this notorious character. I mean, his name was Niccolo, and so he got called Old Nick, the slang name for Satan in the Renaissance. Anyway, Machiavelli said, look, in politics, you sometimes have to get your hands dirty. You sometimes have to do things that morality frowns upon. And I think we've overdrawn that conclusion by thinking of politics as a sphere in which morality doesn't operate at all. Machiavelli had something very particular in mind. He imagines a prince who's actually working for the common good. And this prince, because he's dealing with other people who are morally quite imperfect, sometimes has to cut the moral corners and do things that are shady. And Machiavelli is very clear that he wants as little of this as possible. But he recognizes the need for some of it. Well, that was a huge shock when he wrote, but it shouldn't be a shock to us. But we, I think, have gone far too far with this. We think that, as it were, talking about the moral behavior or the moral constraints on the behavior of leaders is just silly. It's just sort of foolishly utopian. And that seems to me quite wrong. And when I think about morality in connection with politics, I think about the great and deep responsibility of our leader to do what Machiavelli's prince is supposed to do, and to take steps to learn things and to consult and get proper advice.
When we're thinking about the moral responsibilities of leaders to respond to experts or to consult experts in crises such as the one we find ourselves in, I wonder whether those responsibilities extend to a responsibility to understand the science that's being communicated to them. So do our leaders need to be technocrats or?
No, they can't be technocrats. There's far too much that technocrats collectively know for them to learn, even if they were really, really good students. No, what they have to do is they have to find out, they have a responsibility to find out who's trustworthy on a given set of issues and to go to those people. Our policies, however well-intentioned we are, our policies will be disastrously wrong if we're misinformed. And if there are people in the country or around the world who actually know facts that bear on the kinds of decisions we make, then we have a responsibility when the lives of many, many other people depend on what we do to consult those people.
Max, maybe you'd like to jump in here. So what might you say to those people who think that in the present moment we're farming out too much responsibility to non-democratically elected figures like scientists?
So, I mean, I can understand why people, both scientists and the public, might be worried about simply asking scientists to craft policies, right? So we don't want to put a situation where the leader, as Philip said, simply farms things out to Fauci and doesn't take responsibility. You know, when Trump says, I take no responsibility. I think it's really important that leaders listen to the experts and the relevant range of experts and craft, and if there are people, as people are proposing policies, to implement the policies that are best supported by the evidence, but that actually the leader is supposed to be a democratically represented representative of the electorate. And it is the leader's responsibility to say that when it comes to, who is responsible for mistakes, as a president has said, the buck stops here. And I think it's very important for experts and scientists and other technocrats to be able to do their job, that they are working for a leader who is prepared to cop the responsibility to say, at the end of the day, you've advised me, but it's my responsibility to have identified the right sources of advice and then to understand that advice and to implement that advice and to take the role of standing for it rather than, and to an extent, I think something of this has happened in the UK at various points when the government has sort of tried to shift. The good thing to do is to say, look, we're listening to these people, but it's important to also say, and we are therefore responsible for what we do. And I think that creates social trust in the leaders and in the experts and in the solutions that get selected through that process. And I think that kind of social trust is always going to be absolutely requisite for success in a case like this. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's shift the focus a little. So Philip, you've written about the role of science in a democratic society. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about how you see the accountability of scientific research to democratic goals.
Well, I think when scientists are trying to figure out in which direction to go, they are not, as it were, the sole authorities of what kind of research should be done. The public should have a say in the direction of scientific research. There should be an institutional mechanism, I think, for ensuring that scientific research itself develops in ways that are likely to advance the public good. And so at the end of the day, I think of science as I think of moral life as a kind of piecemeal project. We're not out to find the complete truth about the world. We're out to find the answers to certain kinds of problems which are of broad and general interest, both because they give us understanding of the world, and most importantly, because they enable us to solve practical problems. And the public should have a say in determining what kinds of priorities scientists set in their research. So I've envisaged in various things I've written a kind of forum in which scientists come together with the public, and the public gets the opportunity to put forward the kinds of research that it thinks are most important. That would make a difference on some occasions. It would make a difference to when, for example, infectious disease research was really neglected for a very, very, very long time. And yet, if you'd actually looked around the world and asked the general population, the general human population, whether that was an important goal, you would have gotten an overwhelming yes, not only from the global south, but also from many people in the north who saw the need for investigating infectious diseases. Luckily, people like Fauci have been in that business for a long time, but there was a period, quite a long period, where the budget of the NIH for infectious disease looked like a rounding error compared to the money given, say, to cancer or to cardiovascular disease. And that was a mistake. We're behind, we have been behind where we should have been with things like pandemics.
So Max, maybe if we move to questions about ethical theories and decision procedures that public officials and scientists should be using when they're making decisions in fast-moving situations like the one that we find ourselves in, and in particular in situations that involve like big collective problems. And of course, this is an area in which you have some expertise. So you've argued that collective problems like climate change, for example, present cases in which the best outcomes won't be reached if the individual agents deliberate like act utilitarians. And so I thought maybe you could expand a little on this view, which you quite catchingly called utility cascades for our listeners, and tell us a little bit about whether and how you think this sort of problem might arise in responses to the coronavirus.
Yeah, so in the climate change case, there are some people who say, well, when we're asking an ethical question, the person who is addressed by ethics should think of themselves as utilitarians say, as the marginal individual. So you think, given what everyone else is expected to do, what's the option that I can pick that's going to have like the best expected outcomes, like leaving fixed what everyone else is doing? So for example, lots of people have said, look, surely the best way to solve some of the biggest problems that face humanity is to engage in political or structural or sort of systematic reforms. And there's a style of utilitarian who thinks in the way that I just described, who says, well, look, that would be great if it were to work. But, it's so implausible that you need other people to join in for that to work. It's not going to be very effective unless lots of people cooperate, and they're unlikely to. And so, you really shouldn't pursue that kind of structural reform. And they end up proposing things that really look like band-aids in a situation. But of course, they're recommending this to lots of people not to pursue substantive reform, which of course makes it less likely that substantive reform happens. And you can see how this thinking can pan out in the climate change case. So there was a piece a few months ago in the New Yorker by Jonathan Franzen saying, well, trying to prevent climate change made sense when the battle was winnable, but it's now so unlikely that we will be able to win it that we shouldn't focus on prevention. We should just focus on mitigation. Like, we can't prevent it. We should just try and make it less bad when it happens. But of course, by promoting this way of thinking, you reduce the possibilities of prevention even further. And you can see this kind of thinking happening in the COVID case, when some people have sort of said, oh, well, just no way of preventing large numbers. We saw this a little bit in the UK about a month ago, when there was a kind of thought that there was no way of suppressing the spread, and just have to manage huge numbers of people getting infected and dying in the most orderly way possible. Of course, if you promote that view, it does make it very hard to actually do the kinds of really difficult and demanding collective actions that are taken to prevent the worst outcomes. Mm-hmm. But I think it's very important that we don't think in those terms, and we don't think of ourselves as, I'm just the marginal individual working with the probabilities and the situation as fixed, but thinking we collectively can change the situation in order to be able to pick better outcomes than I myself could achieve if I only think about myself in isolation. Whether I be, an individual actor or a politician or a philanthropist, or even a state. I mean, we need to think, when we think about the pandemic, one thing that depressingly is not talked enough about is not just how individual countries can institute policies, given that what everyone else is doing, that will be good, but to think what will be the best forms of policy for us collectively. And there are some ways of solving this problem that would be really great, but require collective cooperation. And that's the sort of thing I think we need to be exploring in more detail.
Thank you. Philip, is there anything that you want to say in response to this?
I have a view that the way of putting it in terms of this is a winnable battle and we've lost it, it's quite clear that the future environment in which our descendants live will be less hospitable than the environment in which all of us have grown up. But this is very much a statistical and a probabilistic matter. We can't actually even say very much about all the possible futures. What we know is that the range of possible futures, if we take certain actions now, will be better for our descendants than if we don't. So I don't like this metaphor of a winnable war. I prefer a different one. So I'm going to tell you a story and see if this will sort of foster your intuitions. Okay, so you go off and you visit some apparently extremely nice people. And after you've been there for a while, one day their mood changes quite dramatically. They grab you and they lock you in a room and they present you with a gun. And the gun has in it an enormous number of chambers. And they tell you that some of these chambers have bullets in, the bullets are of various degrees of deadliness, and there's a pack of cards on the table and you're to draw one from the pack and put the gun against your head or whatever body part is named on the card and pull the trigger. And you're absolutely horrified. This is just dreadful. And then you plead with them and they say, well, we'll give you some time. I'll tell you what, if for the next year or two, you live under a very, very, very strict regime indeed, which will change your life in many ways. In the future, you'll be given a different deck of cards and a different gun. And the gun that you will get will have less bullets in it, and some of the bullets will be much less deadly. And the cards will sometimes have you pointing the gun at your knee rather than your temple, or sometimes even having you shoot out of the window. So what are you going to do? That's the situation we're in. We've got to decide whether to live with a burdensome set of rules and constraints and regulations and give ourselves the chance down the road, or better, give our descendants a chance down the road of operating with a more benign deck and a less deadly gun. And the real difficulty here, the difficulty that I think that holds up the kind of collective action that Max is so concerned to see, and I'm so concerned to see, is the fact that that decision problem is extremely hard, because you just can't represent the possibilities and assign them probabilities in any reasonable way. There are just huge numbers of scenarios as we look into the future that could be absolutely awful. Pandemics, the like of which would far exceed what we're going through at the moment. Wars breaking out because of lack of water or because of flooding. Migration on a scale that the human population has never seen before. There are all of these things. We have no idea how probable they are. We have no idea about the ways in which they will interact. So it is, I think, extremely hard to get your head around this problem. And we simplify it artificially by saying either we'll win it or the war or we won't. That's a mistake. We've got to face up to the problem and find some satisfactory way of coming to terms with the probabilities and taking on the kinds of burdens collectively that are reasonable and not burdening contemporary people whose lives are already precarious more than they need to be. So, I'm very much in the spirit of Max's proposal for collective action. I just think that there is something intrinsic to this particular problem that makes it difficult to think through it.
Why don't we move now from collective problems to moral dilemmas, since we promised this subject to our audience as well. Okay. So Max, you were recently interviewed by Wired magazine, and you discussed some of the everyday moral dilemmas that people like all of us are facing as we come to terms with our altered reality during the pandemic. And so I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you understand the notion of a moral dilemma, and where you think they might arise in our present situation, and whether philosophy can supply us with practical solutions. Yeah,
so the sort of thing I think that the sort of moral dilemma I have in mind that I think that people are facing on a day-to-day basis, and people are really becoming aware of the deep significance of this, is a case, say, you may be a delivery driver working on a 0 hours contract. So you don't have any job security, and you also have children. And if you don't do your job, then you're a gig worker. So you're in the gig economy. That's the way of putting it. If you don't work those hours, you won't have money to put food on the table for your children or to pay your rent. But you've noticed that you have a cough. And you know that if you go out with a cough, delivering food, you put other people at risk. And so now you face a choice between, on the one hand, your obligations to your family, which I think are real and important moral obligations. On the other hand, your obligations to the rest of society, to the community that you're in. And those are also real and important moral obligations. And so we can say, what should you do? Given the situation where there is, before there's any stimulus packages or any support packages have been passed, and indeed it's not clear how they affect certain people on very precarious contracts, do you fail to provide for the basic needs of your family? Or do you put strangers at risk? Well, that's a classic moral dilemma of the sort that people have become increasingly aware of. The internet is full of memes about the trolley problem. Normally it's in terms of numbers of people. I've phrased it in terms of also different types of relationship. And there's often an assumption that two things are true. That one, what's really important about this case is just what's described within the case, just this one individual, right? And that philosophy is supposed to give you an answer. It's supposed to tell you, this is the right thing to do. You should, in the trolley case, kill the 5 to save the 1 or whatever it is. And people want philosophy to give you this kind of clear-cut answer. But I think that when philosophy tries to do that, it often actually just cuts out a bit of the moral complexity, the reality of the situation as humans experience it. Right? So in this case that I've given, where we have you're torn between your family and your community, I think that there is a real, the dilemma can't be sort of dissolved by philosophy. It's, as some philosophers call it, a moral tragedy. Something terrible happens either way. Perhaps one option is better or worse than the other, but there's no way that you can get out of this without doing something that you should feel, that you would feel terrible about and reasonably feel terrible about. And in a way, whichever option you pick, I think we can all understand the difficulty of not picking that option or picking the other option. So I think philosophy can't always resolve these things. I think there are moral tragedies, but I also think we shouldn't end with that thought. So actually, I'm going to use something that you once said, which is the real question about the trolley problem is, what is wrong with our society that it has so many runaway trolleys in it? It's not about just ending up with, oh, well, we've got a moral dilemma. I guess it's a moral tragedy. I guess it sucks to be that person who has to face that terrible question. That's not the end of what we should be thinking. What we should be thinking about is, what are our responsibilities to prevent other people from having to make choices of this nature? When we hear about a moral dilemma, we shouldn't just think, what's the right answer or how terrible to be facing it, but how can we prevent cases like this? What can we do in order to lessen that terrible burden that people are facing, and in order to make sure that people don't end up in situations where they have to choose between sacrificing their children and risking the lives of strangers? I think when we think about moral dilemmas in those terms, they can be a stimulus for a kind of cultural growth and social development where we all take more responsibility for the rest of our community. And I'm sort of on the same note about the collective, about coordination, cooperation, about thinking about we, not just an individual, sort of abstracted individual, but as a community. But I think that, what we think about when we face the gig worker who has this terrible problem is not what should she do or what's the right answer, but how can we set things up? How can we support these people so they're not placed in a situation like that?
So that's a fantastic note on which to end our conversation and to open things up to our audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my colleague, Ryan Doody, who is going to run the question and answer session.
All right, so we have a number of questions. Let me first call on Alexandra. In countries such as Italy, where doctors are having to practice wartime medicine and make very difficult decisions about who to treat and who not to treat, do you think that we will see changes in attitudes toward physician-assisted death and laws relating to physician-assisted death?
I think that's very hard to predict. It seems to me that the attitude that's likely to emerge from this situation is we had to do some appalling things, or things that would have been appalling under normal circumstances, because we were placed in one of the sorts of situations Max has eloquently described, a moral dilemma. It arose for us. We had to solve it as best we could. We very much regret that we had to leave, you know, the old person or the infirm person without a ventilator. But we did the best we could. We suspect that the older people would have acceded to the idea that the ventilator should be given to somebody younger. It's very different when it's in a situation where there is enough to go around and the old person's life isn't directly threatened, then to say that the physician should come in and help that person if he or she wants to put an end to it. I mean, the problem is that there's so much of a difference between the two situations that I can see ample room for people who want to resist the idea of assisting people to die to make that resistance. I myself think the world would be a much better place if we could allow people to be assisted in their dying when they really want to. There have to, of course, to be provisions and safeguards in place, but I don't see this particular crisis moment as easing the way for that.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to another question that is also about sort of rationing of healthcare, and it applies to the very first thing we talked about. So this is a question from Ian, and it's to Philip. And the question is this: what reason is there to think that a rule that said that Philip should get the ventilator and not the young person would be unacceptable to all? And sort of more generally, what are the standards that govern our attempts to establish shared norms in these novel situations? Well,
let's imagine a council of people with sufficient time to talk this through in advance. And let's imagine there being young people there and older people there. The young people will surely say, look, one thing that comes from our perspective is we have years ahead of us. We have years of life that we can profitably live. You have already had a rich and fulfilling and relatively long life. Don't you think that you should make the same opportunity available to us? And I think an older person should respond to that. An older person who's genuinely engaged with the perspective of the younger person ought to see the force of that. And as a result, accede to giving up the ventilator. Indeed, if it was proposed to go the other way around, it was supposed to go to me rather than, say, to Max. I'm going to be very grim here. If it's supposed to go to me rather than to Max, I guess I would say, no, that isn't appropriately responsive to Max and his aspirations. And I can understand that. I can sympathize with it. And I would rather he had it than me. I mean, I don't want to die. Let's be very clear about this. I still feel I've got lots of life left in me, but I can see the force of these kinds of considerations.
Let's go on to another question that is also about norms in these novel situations. So there was early on the point was made that we can think of these norms as like instruments or tools. This is a question from Jeff, which is that many instruments are used without regard to their impact on others. So why think that the tool of morality should be used in that way? This is not a suggestion that they shouldn't be used in that way, but you know, something more than just the observation that it's a tool might need to be brought into play. And what do you think that extra?
The function of the tool is to bring us together, to have us respond to others. The problem we have to solve in our moral life is to increase our responsiveness to others. Now, in a way, what I'm saying ought to be terribly familiar. It's in there in the doctrines of all major religions. I mean, think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? I mean, that's all about being responsive to another person, somebody whom you haven't previously met. And that question comes up when Jesus is talking about being good to your neighbor, and a lawyer in the audience says, but who is my neighbor? And Jesus then tells the story of the Good Samaritan in answer to this. Actually, it doesn't answer the question, because if you sympathize for a moment with the lawyer, what the lawyer wants to know is, who is your neighbor in the story that Max told, when you've got conflicting pulls, when you've got the family needing food and you've got the potentially infected people to whom the delivery person will deliver. Who is your neighbor in that case? Well, you work out who deserves priority here, it seems to me, through bringing people together, through trying to understand all the points of view and integrating them as best you can. And so I go back to the idea that this tool of morality has built into it from the very beginning the idea of responding to other people and having this kind of exchange that hopefully leads to an outcome that everybody can regard as tolerable.
I completely agree with that. I think one really interesting case, so another sort of norm development that I didn't discuss, but I think is really important, is our norms about who we think of as praiseworthy or estimable, or who we should admire. And we've had this incredible development. A few months ago, when the UK unveiled its new immigration policy, it classified a wide variety of people as being unskilled laborers and low priority. For example, care workers. Now the UK government has created a new list of what are regarded as essential workers. And many people who have been often denigrated as unskilled, have very little social respect or esteem, care workers, people who work in supermarkets, in food delivery, as I mentioned, many members of the gig economy who don't have a lot of status, who don't get a lot of esteem and admiration for their work, actually, often very undervalued. We've come to realize that these people are actually far more essential for the survival of our society than many very highly paid workers in areas. I don't want to point any fingers, but it's not.
Well, the university professors.
Sure, we're still working, but yeah, and it's not necessarily the person developing a snazzy new app or the international financier who is an essential worker. It's often the care worker or the gig economy driver. And one thing I would really want us to think about is we need to respect these people and value these people more. Why? Because we all depend upon them. And we need to think about our valuation as being responsive, as Philip said, to the needs of our society. And sometimes when people do, when they think about who they should admire, people don't really think who should I admire, but they think, oh, well, that person, well, he's very clever, he's made lots of money, therefore he should be admired. Or maybe we think someone is very, just being very good at something alone, especially if it comes with lots of money, is itself a reason to admire someone. But I think we should think about who we think of as those that we value most, more in terms of how did these people contribute to meeting society's needs? And it's a shift of perspective. So Hume, some we haven't mentioned so far, famously said that in his society there was a lot of admiration for people who were very sort of self-flagellating and self-denying, because that was religiously regarded just intrinsically admirable. That's just intrinsically impressive. And he said, what's the point? What good does this do? What he called the monkish virtues. What good do they do to anyone? we need to think about virtues and the character traits we admire in terms of, as he said, are they useful or agreeable to self or others, in terms of what benefit they serve to the rest of society. And I think we can take that perspective and think, at the end of the day, there might be people who are very clever at extracting lots of wealth from society, but unless we can say what good they do, maybe we shouldn't look up to them so much. And there are certain people who might not be very good at looking flashy and glamorous, and who don't have glamorous jobs, who are driving delivery trucks or changing people's bed sheets in a hospital or a nursing home or a hospice. But actually those are the people that we should admire the most, and who we should regard as having they are skilled people, because those are skills that we need and skills that we can't live without.
So I'm going to have to stop this conversation here, although of course we could go on for hours. It's been just marvelous. I'd like to thank both of the participants. So I'd like to thank Philip Kitcher and Max Hayward for joining us today. It's been an honor and a privilege, and I know that many members of the UNC PPE community are online with us, and I'm sure that we'll continue this conversation in other fora.